welcome to the channel. Please like this video and subscribe. I hope you enjoy the story. Let's begin. Colton Hayes tapped his roughened fingers rhythmically on the steering wheel, his gaze locked on the small two-story home that he and Renee shared. The evening sun stretched long shadows over the perfectly manicured lawn, a sharp contrast to the turmoil brewing in his stomach. He inhaled deeply, shut off the engine of his battered pickup truck, and grabbed the envelope resting on the passenger seat. $150,000, he muttered, shaking his head. This had better be the last of it. The envelope, filled with papers that finalized the last payment of his mother-in-law's debt, weighed heavily in his grip. Colton clenched his jaw, recalling the endless overtime shifts, the odd jobs, and all the sacrifices he had made to clear Arlene's debt. He had done it all for his family, all for Renee. Stepping out of the truck, the crisp Denver air bit at his skin as his boots crunched over the gravel in the driveway, every step taking him closer to what he hoped would be the start of a new chapter. No more debt, no more stress, just him and Renee. Finally building the life they had always dreamed of. He paused at the front door, straightening his well-worn flannel shirt and running a hand through his short, dark hair. A flicker of movement caught his attention. The living room curtain twitched as it snapped back into place. Colton's brow furrowed. Something felt off. As soon as he stepped inside, the tension in the air hit him like a physical blow. Renee stood in the middle of the room, her arms crossed, her normally warm brown eyes now cold and distant. Perched on the edge of the couch like a predator was Arlene, her sharp gaze locked on the envelope in Colton's hand. "You're late," Renee said, her tone flat. Colton narrowed his eyes. "Traffic was bad, but I've got the final payment. It's done, Arlene. You're debt-free." He extended the envelope, expecting gratitude or relief. Instead, Arlene snatched it from his hand, her red lacquered nails standing out against the crisp white paper. "Well, it's about time," she sniffed, flipping through the documents. "I was beginning to think you'd never come through." Colton bit his tongue, turning instead to his wife. "Renee, what's going on? I thought we'd celebrate tonight. This is a big deal for us." Renee's laugh was harsh, devoid of humor. "Celebrate? Oh, Colton, always so naive." Her words hit him like a slap. He took a step back, staring at the woman he thought he knew, but who now felt like a stranger, cold and hard where there had once been warmth. "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked, his voice low. Renee sighed, uncrossing her arms and reaching for a sleek leather purse on the coffee table. "It means, Colton, that while you were busy playing hero and paying off my mother's debts, I've been making plans of my own." Colton's heart raced, a sickening feeling growing in his gut. "What kind of plans?" "The kind that don't include you," Arlene chimed in, a smug smile creeping across her Botoxed face. Renee shot her mother a warning glance before looking back at Colton. "I've met someone, Colton, someone who can give me the life I've always wanted." "The life you—" "Well, you've tried, I'll give you that, but it's not enough. It's never been enough." The room spun as Colton gripped the back of a chair, his knuckles turning white. "You're having an affair?" "Don't act so surprised," Renee said, rolling her eyes. "Did you really think I'd be content with this?" She gestured around the modest living room, her lip curling in disdain. "The tiny house? The budget vacations? Always just getting by." Colton's shock was quickly replaced by anger. "We built this life together, Renee. Everything I've done for us, for our future." "Well, my future is with Grant now," Renee snapped. "Grant Calloway. He's a corporate lawyer, Colton. Do you have any idea what kind of life he can give me?" The name hit Colton like a punch to the gut. Grant Calloway. He'd heard whispers about the man's shady business practices. "You're leaving me for that snake." Renee's eyes flashed. "That snake has more ambition in his little finger than you have in your entire body. He understands me, Colton. He knows what I need." "And what about what I need?" Colton's voice rose as the hurt and betrayal boiled over. "I've given everything for this family. I just finished paying off your mother's massive debt." Arlene cleared her throat. "Yes, well, consider that your parting gift, dear, a token of appreciation for services rendered." Colton spun to face her. "You knew about this? You let me pay off your debt knowing Renee was planning to leave." Arlene shrugged, inspecting her nails. "A mother always looks out for her daughter's best interests. And let's be honest, Colton, you were never going to be enough for my Renee. The room fell into a heavy silence. Colton's mind raced, piecing together countless little moments, the late nights, the new clothes, the sudden interest in fine dining. He had been blind, too focused on providing to see the cracks forming in his marriage. How long, he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Renee hesitated, a flicker of guilt or maybe regret crossing her face. 6 months. The betrayal cut deep, but Colton refused to break in front of them. He straightened, taking a deep breath. When he spoke, his voice was calm. Then both of you need to leave. Renee blinked, surprised by his composure. What? You heard me, Colton said, his eyes cold. If you're choosing him, if this is really what you want, then get out, both of you. Now. Arlene stood, her face a mask of indignation. Now, Colton, you can't just... I can, and I am, he interrupted. This is my house. My name's on the mortgage. You want to throw away our marriage for some rich lawyer? Fine. But you're not doing it under my roof. Renee's smug expression wavered, replaced by uncertainty. Colton, be reasonable. We need time to. To what Colton's laugh was bitter. To pack up everything you want for your new life. To strip this place bare like you've stripped away every bit of trust I had in you? No, you made your choice. Now live with it. He strode to the front door and yanked it open. Get out. For a moment, neither woman moved. Then, slowly, Renee grabbed her bag. Fine, she said tightly. We'll go to Grant's. His parents have plenty of room. Of course they do, Colton muttered as Renee and Arlene gathered their things. An awkward silence settled over the room. Colton stood by the door, arms crossed, watching as his soon-to-be ex-wife prepared to leave. Just before stepping out, Renee paused. Colton, Save it, he cut her off, his voice icy. I don't want to hear whatever excuse you've come up with. Just go. With one last glance, almost regretful, Renee walked out, Arlene close behind. As their footsteps echoed down the driveway, Colton slammed the door, the sound reverberating through the now empty house. For a long moment he stood there, forehead pressed against the cool wood. Then, with a roar of frustration and pain, he spun around, driving his fist into the framed wedding photo hanging in the entryway. Glass shattered, raining down onto the floor. Colton barely felt the sting of cuts on his knuckles as he tore the photo from its broken frame. Renee's smiling face stared back at him, frozen in time. You think I'm weak, he growled, crumpling the photo in his fist. You think I'll just let this slide? You have no idea who you're dealing with. With newfound resolve, Colton strode to his home office, turned on his computer, and retrieved a stack of files related to Arlene's debt and his marriage to Renee. Years of managing intricate construction projects had sharpened his focus, and his mind raced as he sought a way to turn the tables, to make them pay for their betrayal. As he pored over financial documents and legal agreements, an idea began to form. Hours slipped by unnoticed, the sky outside shifting from twilight to deep black. Colton's attention remained laser-focused as he pieced together his plan for revenge. As dawn approached, he finally leaned back in his chair, a grim smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Got you, he muttered, staring at the screen. Hidden in the fine print of the loan agreement he'd signed to pay off Arlene's debt, he found his salvation a clause that would nullify the entire payment if Renee violated their marital contract. Colton's eyes gleamed with triumph and barely suppressed anger. They thought they had won, believed they could toss him aside like garbage, but they had gravely underestimated him. As the first light of day crept through the blinds, Colton Hayes made a solemn vow he wouldn't rest until justice was served, until Renee, Arlene, and Grant Calloway felt the full consequences of their actions. Let them think they'd broken him, that he was beaten. Colton would play the part of the wronged, passive husband for now, but behind the scenes he would be meticulously plotting their downfall. With renewed purpose, Colton began gathering proof of Renee's infidelity, phone records, credit card bills, social media activity, anything that could confirm her breach of their marriage agreement. His years in construction had taught him the importance of paying attention to detail, and now he applied that skill with ruthless precision. Days turned into weeks, and Colton threw himself into the task, maintaining the facade of a man struggling to cope with the collapse of his marriage. But beneath the surface he was consumed by a singular purpose. It was at a barbecue hosted by a mutual friend that Colton first encountered Renee since that fateful night. She looked radiant, hanging on the arm of a tall, polished man whom Colton assumed was Grant Calloway. Steeling himself, Colton approached them, plastering on a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Renee," he greeted her, his voice carefully neutral, "you're looking well." Renee, clearly startled by his presence, stammered, "Colton, I didn't expect to see you here." Obviously, Colton responded dryly before turning to Grant, extending his hand. "And you must be the famous Grant Calloway. I've heard a lot about you." Grant's handshake was firm, his smile slick. "Likewise, Colton. I hope there are no hard feelings. These things, well, they happen, don't they?" It took everything Colton had not to punch the smug bastard right then and there. Instead, he shrugged, adopting an air of resigned acceptance. "You're right," he said. "They do happen. I just hope you two are happy together. That's all I ever wanted for Renee." He caught a flicker of surprise, and was that guilt? In Renee's eyes, good. Let her believe he was taking the high road. It would make his eventual revenge all the more satisfying. As he turned to walk away, Colton paused and glanced back at Renee. "Oh, and Renee. I'm sorry." "Sorry," she echoed, confusion evident in her voice. Colton nodded solemnly. "For whatever I did to make you unhappy for not being enough. I hope you find what you're looking for with Grant." With that, he walked away, leaving a stunned Renee behind. The moment he was out of sight, his calm mask crumbled and his hands clenched into fists. The encounter had been a strategic necessity meant to lull them into a false sense of security. But it had reopened wounds that were far from healed. That night, sitting alone in his empty house, Colton redoubled his efforts. He dug deeper into Grant Calloway's background, leveraging contacts and calling in favors to uncover the man's secrets. What he found chilled him. Grant Calloway, it seemed, was no stranger to fraud. Using his parents' influence and reputation as cover, he had been involved in several shady real estate ventures and investment scams. Colton's background in construction gave him unique insight into the world of property development, and he could clearly see the web of lies and deception Grant had spun. As the puzzle pieces clicked into place, Colton felt a surge of dark satisfaction. Grant hadn't just stolen his wife, he had unknowingly handed Colton the very means to destroy him. But Colton knew he couldn't rush this. Revenge, like the best construction projects, required careful planning and flawless execution. He would bide his time, gathering more evidence and building an airtight case that would bring Grant Calloway's carefully constructed empire crashing down. And when the dust settled, Renee and Arlene would find themselves right back where they started, or worse. The thought brought a grim smile to Colton's face as he gazed out the window at the distant lights of Denver. "You wanted to play games," he murmured, his reflection hard and determined in the glass. "Well, game on. And this time I'm playing for keeps." The harsh glow of the computer screen cast sharp shadows across Colton's face as he hunched over his desk, poring over financial records. Months had passed since Renee's betrayal, but his determination had only hardened into something unbreakable. His focus was interrupted by a knock at the door. Colton glanced at the clock, 10:30 p.m. Who would show up at this hour? Approaching the door cautiously, he peered through the peephole, and his jaw clenched at the sight of the visitor. Yanking the door open, Colton fixed a cold stare on Arlene. "What do you want?" Arlene flinched at his tone but quickly regained her composure. Now, Colton, is that any way to greet family?" "Family," Colton scoffed. "You lost the right to call yourself that when you helped Renee stab me in the back." "Oh, don't be so dramatic." Arlene waved a dismissive hand. "May I come in?" "It's quite cold out here," Arlene said, but Colton stood firm, blocking her path. "Say what you came to say, then leave," he replied. Arlene's confident facade had slightly, showing a flicker of desperation. It's about the debt, Colton. The one you paid off." "What about it?" "They." "Well," Arlene stammered, "there's been a complication. The creditors, they're claiming the debt wasn't fully settled. They're threatening legal action." Colton's eyes narrowed. "And how is that my problem?" "Come on, Colton," Arlene pleaded, her tone now whiny. "You've always been so good to us. Can't you help out just this one last time?" For a moment Colton said nothing, his face unreadable. Then slowly, a cold smile crept across his lips. "You've got some nerve, Arlene. You helped destroy my marriage, and now you have the audacity to ask for more money." Arlene's eyes widened. "But Colton, I know," he cut her off, his voice like steel. "You made your choice, you and Renee both, and now you can live with the consequences." But what about family?" Arlene asked weakly. Leaning in close, Colton whispered, "My family betrayed me. As far as I'm concerned, I don't have a family anymore." With that, he slammed the door in her face, ignoring her continued pleas as he walked back to his office, feeling a grim satisfaction settle over him. Everything was falling into place. The next morning, Colton found himself at his favorite diner, sipping a cup of black coffee. He'd been visiting more often lately, taking comfort in the familiar surroundings and the absence of pitying stares from the staff. Well, if it isn't the man of the hour," a voice called out from behind him. Colton turned to see Grant Calloway sliding into the booth across from him, that infuriating smirk plastered on his face. "Calloway," Colton said coldly, "what do I owe the displeasure?" Grant chuckled, motioning for the waitress to bring him coffee. "Come on, Colton. I thought we could have a civilized conversation, man to man." About what? Colton's voice was flat. "About Renee, of course," Grant replied, leaning back in his seat, "and how we can all move forward, amicably." Colton's grip on his mug tightened. "Amicably? You steal my wife and now you want us to be friends." Grant's smile didn't falter. "Steal is such a harsh word. Renee made her choice, Colton. I'm just here to ensure there are no lingering issues." "What's that supposed to mean?" Colton asked, his tone icy. Leaning forward, Grant's voice dropped to a low murmur. "It means, Colton, that it would be best for everyone if you just let it go. Move on. Stop digging into things that no longer concern you." Colton's eyes narrowed. "And if I don't?" Grant's tone remained casual, but his eyes hardened. "Let's just say things could get unpleasant for everyone involved." For a long moment they stared each other down, the tension thick in the air. Then Colton slowly stood up. "Thanks for the chat, Calloway," he said, his voice deceptively calm. "But I think we're done here." As he walked away, Colton could feel Grant's gaze burning into his back. Good. Let him think he'd made his point. Little did Grant know, he had only confirmed everything Colton had suspected. Back at home, Colton dove into his research with renewed determination. Grant's veiled threat had only solidified his resolve. He knew he was close to uncovering something significant, and he wasn't about to stop now. As he sifted through financial documents and property records, a clear pattern began to emerge. Grant wasn't just involved in a few questionable deals, he was the mastermind behind an intricate network of fraud and deceit, all while using his parents' reputation and connections as cover. Colton's phone buzzed, pulling him from his concentrated state. The screen flashed with an unknown number. "Hello," he answered cautiously. "Is this Colton Hayes?" a woman's voice asked. "Who's asking?" "My name is Lydia Calloway," the voice replied. "I believe we have a shared interest to discuss." Colton's heart skipped a beat. "Calloway?" "I'm listening," he said warily. Not over the phone, Lydia insisted. "Can you meet me? There's a coffee shop on 5th and Main. 1 hour." Colton hesitated, considering his options. This could be a trap, but it could also be the break he'd been waiting for. "I'll be there," he finally said. An hour later, Colton sat in a corner booth of the busy cafe, scanning the crowd. A woman in her mid-30s approached, exuding confidence, though her eyes betrayed caution. "Colton Hayes?" she asked as she slid into the seat across from him. He nodded. "Lydia Calloway, I presume." Lydia gave a tight, humorless smile. "Grant's estranged sister, at your service." "And why are you reaching out to me?" Colton asked, still guarded. Leaning forward, Lydia's voice dropped. "Because I know what my brother's been up to, and I want him to pay for it." Colton's eyes narrowed. "Why should I trust you?" "You shouldn't," Lydia admitted bluntly. "But I have information you need, and you have the drive to use it." For the next hour, Lydia painted a damning picture of Grant's activities. As a financial analyst, she had access to insights that had eluded even Colton's thorough investigation. "He's using our parents," she explained, disgust clear in her tone. "They think they're investing in legitimate businesses, but Grant's funneling the money into his own schemes." Colton processed the information, his mind racing. "And Renee? What's her involvement?" Lydia's expression darkened. "Your ex-wife? She's in this up to her neck. Grant's using her real estate connections to move his more questionable deals." Hearing it so plainly, the confirmation hit Colton like a punch. He'd suspected Renee's involvement, but now it was undeniable. "Why are you telling me all this?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. Lydia met his gaze, her eyes filled with both determination and regret. "Because someone needs to stop him. And you, Colton, have more reason than anyone to bring my brother down." As Colton left the coffee shop, his head spun with everything Lydia had revealed, but amidst the chaos, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had the pieces he needed now, it was just a matter of putting them together. Over the following weeks, Colton worked tirelessly, matching Lydia's intel with his own findings. He methodically built a case, documenting every shady deal, every falsified contract. Then one Saturday afternoon, the doorbell rang unexpectedly. When Colton opened it, he found Renee standing on the porch, looking uneasy. "Renee," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "What are you doing here?" She fidgeted with her purse, avoiding his eyes. I need to talk to you, Colton. Can I come in?" Against his better judgment, Colton stepped aside, letting her in. They stood in the living room, the awkward silence between them heavy with the weight of their shared past. The tension was palpable. "Well," Colton finally prompted when Renee remained quiet. She took a deep breath before speaking. "I made a mistake, Colton, leaving you. It wasn't what I thought it would be." Colton's jaw tightened. "And what exactly did you think it would be, Renee?" "I don't know," she exclaimed, throwing her hands up in frustration. "I thought it would be exciting, glamorous. But Grant, he's not who I imagined him to be." "And who did you think he was?" Colton's voice was steely. "A knight in shining armor to save you from your dull life with me." Renee winced at the sharpness of his words. "That's not fair, Colton." "Fair?" Colton cut her off, his carefully maintained calm starting to crack. "You want to talk about fair? Was it fair when you threw away our marriage for a man you barely knew? Was it fair when you let me pay off your mother's debt, all while planning to leave me?" Tears welled up in Renee's eyes. "I'm sorry, Colton. I know I hurt you, but I'm here now, trying to make things right." For a brief moment, Colton allowed himself to remember the woman he once loved, the future they had envisioned together. But that woman was gone, replaced by the stranger standing in front of him. "It's too late for that, Renee," he said softly. "Whatever we had, it's gone. You made sure of that." "But can't we try?" Renee pleaded, reaching for his hand. "For old time's sake." Colton pulled away, his face hardening. "Old times? The old times are dead, Renee. You killed them, and now you have to live with that choice." Renee's face crumpled in despair. "Colton, please." "I think you should go," Colton said firmly. "Whatever you came here hoping for, you're not going to find it." As he shut the door behind a tearful Renee, Colton felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. He had finally faced his past and emerged stronger. Now it was time to focus on the future and on bringing down those who had wronged him. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place a week later. Lydia called with critical information about a major deal Grant was about to finalize, one that would cement his fraudulent empire and potentially ruin countless investors. "It's happening next Friday," Lydia explained, her voice tense. "If we're going to stop him, we have to act before then." Colton nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "I'm ready. Let's end this." With Lydia's insider knowledge and the evidence Colton had meticulously gathered, they formulated a plan. Colton would confront Grant, Renee, and everyone involved, laying bare the full extent of their crimes and giving them a single chance to come clean. As the day of reckoning drew nearer, Colton felt an odd sense of calm settle over him. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice, about making sure that those who thought they were above the law finally faced the consequences of their actions. The night before the confrontation, Colton stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie. The man staring back at him was a far cry from the one who had stood there months ago, shattered by betrayal. This man was stronger, wiser, and unafraid. "Time to finish this," Colton muttered to his reflection. He picked up his phone and sent out the carefully crafted invitations he had prepared for Renee, Arlene, Grant, and his parents, summoning them to his house under the pretense of finalizing the divorce and settling the debt. Little did they know, they were walking into their own reckoning. The next morning, the sunlight cast long shadows across Colton's living room as he carefully arranged the chairs, each one representing a player in this elaborate game of deceit and betrayal. Now, it was time for the final move. A sharp knock at the door interrupted his thoughts, signaling the arrival of his guests. Colton took a deep breath, bracing himself for what was to come. He opened the door to find Renee and Arlene standing there, both looking uneasy. "Coming," Colton said, his voice neutral. "The others will be here soon." Renee stepped inside, her eyes nervously scanning the room. "Colton, what's this all about? Your message was pretty vague." "All in good time," Colton replied, gesturing toward the chairs. "Please have a seat." As they settled into their seats, another knock signaled the arrival of Grant and his parents, Richard and Marjorie Calloway. Grant's usual confident swagger faltered slightly as he took in the scene. "Well, this is cozy," Grant said, his tone unnaturally cheerful. "A little family reunion, is it?" Colton's gaze locked onto Grant's, and a silent challenge passed between them. "Something like that," Colton replied. "Why don't you all make yourselves comfortable?" Once everyone was seated, a thick tension filled the room. Colton remained standing, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. "I'm sure you're all wondering why I called you here," he began, his voice calm and steady. Arlene shifted in her seat, clearly uneasy. "You mentioned something about finalizing the divorce and settling debts." "Did I?" Colton's lips curled into a humorless smile. "Well, that's partially true. We are here to settle some debts, just not the kind you're expecting." Grant leaned forward, his eyes narrowing suspiciously. "What are you getting at, Hayes?" Colton picked up a thick folder from the table. "I'm not playing any games, Calloway. In fact, I'd say the games are over." He opened the folder, revealing a stack of documents. "For months, I've been gathering evidence, financial records, property deeds, bank statements. It's amazing what you can uncover when you start digging." Renee's face drained of color. "Colton, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about fraud," Renee, Colton said, his voice cold. "Massive, systematic fraud. And guess what? You're all involved." Grant shot to his feet, furious. "This is absurd. You can't just—" "Sit down," Grant, Colton commanded, his tone brooking no argument. To everyone's surprise, Grant sat back down, albeit reluctantly. Colton turned to Richard and Marjorie Calloway. "Mr. and Mrs. Calloway, did you know that your son has been using your reputation and connections to facilitate fraudulent real estate deals?" Richard's face turned bright red. "Grant, what is he talking about?" Before Grant could respond, Colton continued, "He's been manipulating property values, creating shell companies, and funneling money through various schemes. And he's been using your investments to do it." Marjorie gasped, her face pale. "Grant, tell me this isn't true." Grant's confident front started to crumble. "Mom, Dad, I can explain." "Oh, I'm sure you can," Colton interjected sharply. "Just like I'm sure Renee can explain her part in all of this." Every eye in the room shifted to Renee, who looked like she might be sick. I didn't know," she stammered. "Grant told me everything was legitimate." Colton's laugh was harsh. "Come on, Renee. You're smarter than that, or at least I thought you were." He pulled out another document. "This is a list of all the properties you helped flip for Grant. Funny how they all seem to be linked to the same shell companies, don't you think?" Arlene stood up, her face twisted in indignation. "Now, see here, Colton. You can't just accuse people without proof." Colton cut her off. "Oh, I have plenty of proof, Arlene. Enough to bury every one of you." He turned back to the Calloways. "Your son has been lying to you, using your money and reputation to build his little empire of lies. And when it all collapses, which it will, you'll be left to pick up the pieces." Richard Calloway's face had gone pale. "Grant, is this true? Have you been stealing from us?" Grant's polished demeanor was shattered. "Dad, I can fix this. I just need more time." "Time," Colton scoffed. "Time for what, Grant? To dig yourself into a deeper hole? To ruin more people's lives with your schemes?" He turned to address the entire room. "I've spent months putting this together. Every crooked deal, every forged contract, every dollar that's being misused, it's all here." Colton held up a USB drive. "And it's all set to be sent to the SEC, the FBI, and every major news outlet in the country." The room erupted into chaos. Grant lunged for the USB, but Colton sidestepped him easily. Renee broke down in tears while Arlene shouted angrily. Richard and Marjorie Calloway sat in stunned silence, overwhelmed by the revelations. Colton raised his voice above the commotion. Enough the room went quiet as Colton's voice cut through the noise. "Sit down, all of you." Reluctantly, they obeyed. Colton's eyes swept over the room, his gaze firm and unyielding. "Here's what's going to happen," he said in a low, intense voice. "Grant, you're going to admit everything to your parents and the authorities. You're going to pay back everyone you defrauded, including your family." Grant's face twisted in anger. "And why the hell would I do that?" Colton's smile was icy. "Because if you don't, I'll release everything I have. Your career will be over, your reputation destroyed, and you'll spend the next decade in a federal prison if you're lucky." Colton turned to face Renee and Arlene. "As for you two," he said coldly, "Renee, you're going to resign from your real estate firm and confess your involvement in Grant's schemes." Renee's eyes widened in panic. But what about my career?" "Your career is the least of your worries," Colton interrupted. "And Arlene, that debt you conveniently forgot about? It's coming back to haunt you." Arlene's face drained of color. "What do you mean?" Colton pulled out another paper. "Remember the clause in the loan agreement? The one that said the payment would be void if Renee broke our marital contract? Well, guess what adultery counts as a breach?" He slammed the paper down on the table. "That entire $150,000 is now back in your name, Arlene plus interest." Arlene slumped in her chair, her fight gone. "But I can't pay that. I don't have the money." "Not my problem," Colton said coldly. "You should have thought about that before you helped wreck my marriage." He addressed the room again. "You all have a choice to make. Own up to your actions and start fixing what you've done, or I release everything and watch your lives burn." The room fell silent, the weight of Colton's words settling over them. Grant was the first to break the silence, his voice barely a whisper. "You're bluffing," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "You wouldn't really." "Wouldn't I?" Colton interrupted, his tone dangerous. "You took everything from me, Grant. My wife, my trust, my future. Did you honestly think I'd just stand by and let it happen?" He leaned in, his voice cold. "This ends today, one way or another. The only question is how much of your life you're willing to destroy." Richard Calloway cleared his throat, his voice shaky. "Grant, is what he's saying true? Have you really been doing all this?" Grant's shoulders sagged in defeat. "Dad, I'm sorry, I never meant for it to go this far. I thought I could fix it, make it all right." Marjorie let out a choked sob. "Oh, Grant, what have you done?" Colton watched the scene unfold, a grim sense of satisfaction settling over him. He turned to Renee, who was staring at him with a mix of fear and admiration. "Colton," she whispered, her voice trembling. I'm so sorry. I never thought it would come to this." For a moment, Colton allowed himself to remember the woman he once loved, the future they had planned. But that version of her was gone, replaced by the stranger in front of him. "Save it, Renee," he said, his voice devoid of feeling. "Your apologies don't mean anything to me now." Arlene, who had been unusually silent, suddenly spoke up. "You can't do this, Colton. We're family." Colton's laugh was hollow. "Family. You gave up the right to call yourself that when you helped Renee betray me." He turned back to the group. "You have 24 hours to start fixing this. Grant, you'll turn yourself in. Renee, you'll resign from your job and make a full confession. Arlene, you'll start working on repaying the debt." Grant's eyes flashed with one last hint of defiance. "And if we don't?" Colton's smile was cold as he held up his phone. Then I press this button, and everything goes public. Your careers, your reputations, your freedom, it all goes up in flames." He walked to the door and opened it. "You all know the way out. I suggest you use the next 24 hours wisely." One by one they filed out, each lost in their own thoughts. As Grant paused at the door, he turned to Colton, his arrogance resurfacing for a moment. "For someone who claims to be better than us, you've turned out to be quite the vengeful bastard." Colton met his gaze without flinching. "The difference, Grant, is that I'm not doing this for myself. I'm doing it because it's right, because actions have consequences and it's time you all face them." With that, Colton shut the door, blocking out Grant and the others. He stood there for a long moment, feeling the weight of his actions settle over him. Walking to the window, he watched as Grant and the others drove away. A part of him, a small, wounded part, wanted to feel satisfaction in their misery, but all he felt was a quiet sense of resolution. Justice, he realized, didn't always feel good, but it was necessary. His phone buzzed with a message from Lydia. "Is it done?" Colton replied with a single word, "Yes, it's over." As the sun sank lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the living room, Colton allowed himself a moment of contemplation. He thought back to the person he had been at the beginning of all this, trusting, perhaps a little naive, but fundamentally good. Had that version of him survived the trials of betrayal and vengeance? He wasn't sure. But one thing was certain: he would never let himself become a victim again. Colton walked into his home office, where the results of his months-long investigation were spread across the desk. Slowly and meticulously, he began packing everything away. Not to hide it, he meant what he'd said about exposing everything if they didn't follow through, but to close this chapter of his life. As he worked, his thoughts wandered to the future. The construction business he had set aside while pursuing justice now demanded his attention again. Projects awaited his leadership, teams needed guidance, and his life needed rebuilding. It wouldn't be easy. The scars left by Renee's betrayal and Grant's manipulations would take time to mend, but Colton had always been resilient. He had weathered the storm and come out stronger on the other side. The next morning, as Colton prepared to visit his first job site in weeks, his phone buzzed with a flurry of notifications, news alerts, text messages, even a voicemail from his lawyer. He didn't need to read them to know what they said. Grant had turned himself in, Renee had resigned, and Arlene was scrambling to secure a loan to pay back her debt. It was done. As Colton climbed into his truck, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the rearview mirror. The man staring back at him was older, tougher, but still unbroken. He allowed himself a small, grim smile. "Time to build something new," he muttered, starting the engine. As he drove out of the driveway, leaving behind the house that had once symbolized his broken dreams, Colton felt a newfound sense of freedom. The past could not be changed, but the future was his to shape. This time he would construct his life on a foundation of strength, wisdom, and a resolve to never be anyone's fool again. The Denver skyline loomed in the distance, a reminder of the larger world that lay beyond his personal struggles. Colton Hayes was ready to face whatever challenges came next. He had survived betrayal, sought justice, and reclaimed his life. Now it was time to look ahead, to build, to grow. And if anyone tried to cross him in the future, they would quickly learn that Colton Hayes was not a man to be underestimated. As he merged onto the highway, leaving behind the neighborhood where his downfall and rise had unfolded, Colton allowed himself one last thought of Renee, Grant, and the others. "Game over," he said quietly to the empty truck, his voice filled with finality. Then he turned up the radio, fixed his eyes on the road ahead, and drove toward his future, a future he would shape on his own terms. Free from the burdens of betrayal and armed with the knowledge that he had faced the worst and come out victorious. The story of Colton Hayes, the man who refused to be broken, was far from finished. But this chapter, the chapter of revenge and reckoning, had come to an end, and as Denver's towers grew larger on the horizon, Colton knew one thing for sure: whatever came next, he was ready for it.